Hello and welcome, my dear scholars of African literature. This is Dr. Marwa Hanafi, and this is my participation in the 4th International E-Conference, Future Research in Africa's Agenda 2063, Horizons of Integration and Development. My presentation is entitled Teaching African Literature in Egyptian Universities, and it is based on my experience of being a scholar as I received my PhD in African literature in 2014. And since then, I have been teaching African literature both in the undergraduate and graduate levels in the Department of English Language and Literature, Faculty of Women for Art, Sciences and Education, Ain Shams University. This is an outline of my presentation. First, it is going to define what is African literature and why do we teach it in our department. It will deal with the challenges and pleasures of teaching African literature. It will then move to the texts I relied on in designing my courses and why did I choose them. The presentation is going to show the different responses of my students to the different texts with samples of their drawings and feedback. Then, as the staff members of my department strongly believe in the importance of teaching African literature, they will recommend more interesting texts for you to teach. What is African literature? According to the following definitions, it is the body of traditional oral and written literatures in Afro-Asiatic and African languages, together with works written by Africans in European languages. The definition here also refers to many African languages such as Hausa, Arabic, Ge'ez, Ethiopic, and Amharic Afrikaans, the language of South Africa. There is another definition that supports this one. It is literary works of the African continent. African literature consists of a body of work in different languages and various genres, ranging from oral literature to literature written in colonial languages such as French, Portuguese, and English. However, defining African literature is not an easy task. There was a debate, and these are the most important questions posed by the African writers at Makerere University in Uganda in June 1962 at a conference of African writers of English expression. The questions were, was African literature produced in Africa or about Africa? Is about the subject dealt with by a particular book or it must have an African theme? Should it embrace the whole continent or south of the Sahara or just Black Africa? What about language? Should it be in indigenous African languages or it includes Arabic, English, Portuguese, or Afrikaans? Although these questions remained unresolved by the end of the conference, what happens if the African literature is inclusive of all these experiences? Why do we teach African literature in my department? Our strong belief in the importance of teaching African literature rises from the shared geography, history, culture, languages, religions, narrative techniques and motifs, our shared present, and definitely our shared future. We are Egyptians, we are Africans, we are the sons and daughters of this continent. While teaching African literature in my classroom, I faced some challenges such as the expectations of my students, as they expected English texts in the sense that they are written by British authors. They were surprised the first time when they were introduced to African novels written in English. It took them some time to get acquainted to African texts written in English. Also, they were not familiar with the African culture and they found difficulty in pronouncing African names. But after a while, the challenges are soon transformed into pleasures when they found out the closeness of the African culture and literature to the Egyptian ones. In addition to that, the topics of colonialism and post-colonialism captured their attention and provided a powerful insight into the African long history of struggle. What to teach and why. In this part, I'm going to suggest some books that can be regarded as foundational texts that pave the way for students to understand the intellectual, philosophical, and ideological background of many African works of art. The first book is Post-Colonial Studies, The Key Concepts by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffith, and Helen Tiffin, and these are some of the concepts that are very useful to students of African literature. The second book is Culture and Imperialism by Edward Said, and you can find really useful material in Chapter 1, Empire, Geography and Culture, Chapter 3, Two Visions in Heart of Darkness, Chapter 5, Connecting Empire to Secular Imperialism. The third book is Resistance Literature by Barbara Harlow, and the first chapter, The Theoretical Historical Context, is really useful. The fourth book is Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and chapter 1, The Language of African Literature, is very important as it talks about the cultural bomb used by imperial powers to deconstruct the culture of the African people. And finally, The Invention of Africa by Modern Bees, and kindly focus on chapter 1, Discourse of Power and Knowledge of Otherness. It proves to be very useful. After reading these books, you are going to promote the students. They are going to promote the students' understanding of African texts, and here students are asked to connect the ideas articulated by those critics together. Then we are going to move to what to teach. There are very beautiful works of fiction that you can include in your curriculum of African literature. Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, and Season of Migration to the North by Tayyip Saleh, and you can replace it by The Dome Tree of Wet Hamad, again by Tayyip Saleh. You can ask your students to choose one of the concepts they studied in the theoretical background part and apply it on one of these literary texts. Then we are going to move to the responses of my students while studying African literature course. So these beautiful drawings are inspired by reading Things Fall Apart, and they are done by my first year students. Then we are going to move to my third year students when they studied Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So this is the feedback of Huda Ayoub. She says, reading it for the first time was a roller coaster of emotions. Mayar Ayman states, this novella is priceless. I just have known by it how African people were disenfranchised from all their initial parts of life. And Monica Magid states, it's not one of the texts that spotted, it is one of the texts that spotted the light on the major conflicts of the African people and to what extent they were humiliated, enslaved, and victimized. Then I'm going to move to my graduate students. So this is Rana Isam. She says that the African literature course is an absolute treasure and it is one of the most insightful courses. Basant Ali states that reading Decolonizing the Mind urges me to feel that I am a part of the whole African community as well as how I should be proud of my African language identity and who I am. And Shurut Sami states that all through my life I had been impressed by the stories of the Europeans about the burden and mission of civilization for Africa, but after being exposed to the African literature, I felt there are hidden parts about the story of Africa. Here are some of the recommendations by the staff members of my English department. So here, drama genre, The Dilemma of a Ghost by Emma Atta Eyedo, and it is taught by Professor Mona Wahsh and Dr. Huwaida Hassan. Professor Magda Hasab al-Nabiya taught The Shuttering and the Song by Femi Osofison, and it's again a day. Professor Rania Reda taught A Long Walk to Water and Nadine Gordimer's July People. Professor Radwa Ramadan taught Selected Poetry, Sounds of a Cowhide Drum by Oswald Michali and Steve Bakes, Because I Write What I Like. Lumi Gilani also helped in teaching Selected Poetry by Okot Bitek, Song of Lowino, and Jawbat Hiraj al-Gutta by Abdurrahman al-Abnoudi. Omnia al-Khuli also contributed by teaching some of the poems by Amal Dunqal and Odia Othman. Mona Saeed also recommends to watch the movie Blood Diamond as it is based on a true story. How do we incorporate African texts in our curriculum? In the undergraduate level, we teach it in the comparative literature course, courses of novel, drama, and poetry. And the graduate level, we have African literature course, and we can incorporate it in post-colonial literature, women's studies, comparative literature, children's literature. The conclusion: the experience of teaching African literature at our department is a very rewarding experience. It raises the students' awareness to the status quo of Africa and its long history of both oppression and resistance during the colonial and post colonial eras. It motivates students to shatter away all the stereotypical images established by the colonial system of thought and adopt a constructive perception of Africa. It familiarizes the students with the diversity of the African experience, best represented in its different cultures, languages, and religions. It proves its efficiency in establishing a very tight bond between the students and their African continent. Here are the references, and thank you very much for your time.